Hello, my name is Adam Krieger. I'm with Warren Township Youth and Family Services, and I want to welcome everyone to today's workshop and presentation. As you all know, we have been doing virtual workshops throughout this entire process, throughout the entire quarantine period. This is probably about our 7th or 8th workshop. We just did one a week ago on general mental health issues, and before that we had one on college in the age of COVID. And I'm just mentioning that because if you go to our website at www.wtyouthservices.com, you will find a copy of all those previous workshops, as well as we'll of course record this one for anybody who was not able to make it today. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce our presenter. We all know not only are we dealing with the challenges associated with COVID-19, but we have also many parents that I've talked to within the community have also really struggled with how to parent their children the best way possible during a period where people are starting to come to terms more and more with issues related to race. And a lot of parents have asked questions about how can I navigate this? How can I manage this? How can I be the best parent possible? And of course, our mission here at Youth and Family Services is always around being the best parent we can be to our children. And so with that, I'm really excited. This was a topic that I had numerous people contact me and request. And so today's presentation, called Raising Anti-Racist Children, is going to be presented by Joanna Villacorta Griffin. And I'll just tell you a little bit about her, and then I'll have her take over at this point. Joanna is a child therapist working primarily with children and families of color. She holds a clinical specialty in early childhood mental health and supporting parent-child relationships. Her postgraduate coursework has focused on trauma, systemic factors that impact mental health, and cultural humility. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker and have her go ahead.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending our workshop today on raising anti-racist children. I wanted to start by just telling you guys a little bit more about who I am, because I believe that identity examination is really an essential part of this process. So I wanted to model that for you guys, but I also wanted to just give you a little bit more of a sense of who you're listening to today. So as Adam mentioned, I'm a children's therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker by training, and my specialty is really childhood trauma. So I spend really most of my time during the day talking to kids about tough topics. I'm somebody who studied the sociology of race and focus a lot in postgraduate on parent-child relationships, especially within families of color. And more personally, I'm a mother and a wife in a multicultural family. So this topic is extra personal to me because I'm parenting a biracial child myself. I am Filipina, meaning I'm Asian American. My parents are immigrants. And I do identify as a person of color who has experienced racism in my life. But for the purposes of today's talk, we're going to focus our conversation on anti-Black racism. And that I'm doing intentionally. Obviously, there's quite a lot more nuance to it than just white and Black, but I am focusing it on that intentionally today because, well, especially because of the current events and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that it's definitely a topic that is very pertinent to what we're experiencing today as a society. And Black people have had an extremely long history of being oppressed due to the color of their skin in America, from like way back in 1618 and slavery into the 1960s and Jim Crow laws and school segregation, and all the way up to today and the recently, I will say, like publicized, though maybe not infrequent, events of police brutality as well against Black people. And so my philosophy is that the onus is on us, those who benefit from privilege, to do our own education, but to really listen to Black voices who have already created so much content on these topics. So again, I'm not here to talk about the Black experience because I am not Black, but I'm here to share what I've learned in my research and my work, what it means really to navigate the world with some racial privilege. So what duties do we have as people who aren't Black? And what it means for our children not to be Black, and what it means to benefit from privilege and to do our part to use that privilege then to dismantle racism on both like a micro, small scale, and then also advocating for change on a macro scale to create a more just world overall. And I always like to say too that I am somebody who considers myself wildly imperfect. And I feel like this journey regarding racism and anti-racism is really forever. It's not a thing where, like, after attending so many lectures or reading so many books or listening to, you know, a certain number of podcasts, that you like get to print out a certificate of like, you are now an anti-racist or you're now an ally. And no matter how far we think we come or how like woke or educated we think we are, it's really our duty every single day to check our biases, to remain open to feedback, and to learn from our mistakes. And I do make mistakes every single day. One thing that I like that Ibram X. Kendi, who is an author who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then he just recently released a children's book as well called Anti-Racist Baby. But one thing that he has said is that in any moment, you can choose to be racist or anti-racist. In like the very next moment, you might work and resist and push against that and do something that's anti-racist. So it's really this push-pull that's happening within us every day if we choose to be intentional about it. So in our time today, we're going to talk and unpack terms like racism, anti-racism, and what it means to be an anti-racist, and privilege. We are going to talk about, obviously, our role as parents and how to support and teach our children about race and talk to them about race. And it's possible that when these topics are coming up, that it might bring up some stuff for you, a lot of different feelings. So it's really common that some people feel like angry or sad or embarrassed or even ashamed when these topics are being discussed. And so if that is your experience as I'm talking, or as, you know, we're discussing these topics, that you're feeling some of those feelings, all I want is for you guys to just get curious about those feelings, and to also think about the idea that it's always uncomfortable when you're learning or grappling with a new topic. So like, even, you know, like learning to ride a bike without training wheels, for example, where like, you know, you fall down and it's difficult and it kind of hurts and it's not very fun, honestly, at first. But it's part of that process. And then the more that you do it, and as long as you have someone along the way who's helping you to feel safe and comfortable, you can keep going in that journey. And if you are uncomfortable, but also safe, those are the moments of growth. And so these feelings, those like, you know, difficult feelings that might come up, are actually part of the journey. So we're going to be talking about raising anti-racist kids, and we'll talk about what it means to be anti-racist. Before we talk about what it means to be anti-racist, we sort of have to talk about like racism and what is racism. Obviously, I'm sure everyone has their own ideas about what racism is, you know, on a personal level or whatever, but I want to define it for us today just so that we can sort of circle our discussion around the same thing. So the way that I define racism is ideas, actions, and systems that serve the interests of those in the racial majority, and that those in the racial majority have power to put somebody at a disadvantage based on their membership in a racial group. So I'm also going to ask you to think about racism in a bit of a different way. I'm going to pull up a slide, and then actually, believe it or not, we are going to take our discussion to high school math. So, okay, so we're going to be looking at a Cartesian plane, little XY axis thing. So on the left side of our x-axis here, we have micro, meaning we're thinking about racism that's done on a micro scale. That's like on a person-to-person scale. And then on the right side of our x-axis, we have the word macro. Let me just make sure that, see that, okay. Macro, meaning that's racism that's perpetuated on larger scales. And so when I say like racism on larger scales, I mean like things like laws or programs that were meant to benefit one group more than another, made to make it difficult for one group more than another. So like larger systemic things that are impacting bigger sections of society. And then now I'm gonna put up our y-axis. So on the bottom of the y-axis, we have the word unintentional, meaning obviously that somebody doesn't mean to do it, that maybe it's a blind spot, right? All the way up to intentional, obviously meaning on purpose. So we're gonna overlay those two together. Now we have our Cartesian plane. And then so we're thinking about racist actions as being able to be mapped onto this plane. So for example, if somebody like yells the N-word at a Black person on the street, we would map that over here in the top left corner. I just dropped a dot right there in the top left corner, meaning that's something that was done on a micro scale. It's person to person, but it was done highly intentionally, meaning that the person meant to cause harm or hurt by doing that action. And now we're going to talk about something more on a macro scale that was done intentionally. So up here in the top right corner, I've mapped, thinking about like an example is the GI Bill. So the GI Bill was a program that was developed after World War II. So this was so that soldiers returning from serving for the US in World War II could come back, and then they would have access to like a program that would help them to not only get on their feet, but also to really give them a firm place in society. So for example, it included things like education credits and the ability to pursue further education, things like housing loans so that, you know, they could buy a house and, you know, establish a family and really work their way up in society. So the thing with the GI Bill is that there were legislators during that time in primarily the southern states who didn't want Black soldiers who were returning from war to be able to accumulate wealth, because they were afraid then that they would accumulate more power and then would eventually speak out against the Jim Crow laws that were happening in the South during that time. And so they intentionally wrote the law to make it more difficult for Black soldiers returning from serving our country, make it more difficult for them to access those benefits. So for example, they said, okay, well, you know, here's your education credit, but you can only use your education credit at these specific schools. And then maybe at those specific schools, they were only teaching trades that were like low skill trades, for example. So trades in which you couldn't really make as much money as in other schools where maybe they were teaching more skilled labor or you know, professions in which one could accumulate some wealth. So that's something, again, the GI Bill is something that was done on a more macro scale, impacting like larger groups in society, but was done intentionally to make it more difficult for Black soldiers to get those same benefits. So we're going to spend a lot of our attention today on the bottom left-hand quadrant here, and that is the quadrant that is micro and then also unintentional. And so the reason for that is because my guess is that most people sort of fall into this category, and especially you, if you're sitting here watching a webinar on raising anti-racist children, you're probably not somebody who is perpetuating racism on like this really intentional level. And in fact, it's probably something that you're wanting to learn more about, you know, not being racist, right? And so that's why we're spending a lot of our time in this bottom left-hand quadrant. So in this bottom left-hand quadrant, we're thinking about things like, and the dot that I mapped is an example of, like, if you are, say, like walking to the park with your child and then you see a Black man that's in the bushes, and then maybe in your head you start to question what that man is doing there. So maybe you start thinking things like, you know, what is that guy doing? Is he drunk, or is he on drugs? Is he picking up drugs? Is he peeing, or, you know, whatever it is that maybe you're questioning, right? And that questioning that creeps up in our head is an example of the way that racism can unintentionally impact the things that we do or the things that we say. And so there was recently an example in San Francisco where there was a white couple and they were walking in their neighborhood down the sidewalk, and then they saw a man of color who was writing Black Lives Matter on a wall. And then he was actually a Filipino man. And then they questioned him and they said, you know, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Like, this isn't the way to create change. And then the guy was like, well, like, you know, so, okay, like if this were, because I think that they had said something like, you're vandalizing someone's property. And then he said, well, if this were my property, then like, would you have a problem with it? And then they said, no, but we know that this isn't your property. And then they ended up calling the police on that guy. And then the police came, and then, you know, sure enough, that it was his property. But again, that questioning about whether a person belongs in a situation, that those are the ways that, you know, the sort of insidious ways that racism can creep up in our day-to-day and in our actions. And so the talk today is really focusing on how those macro systems, how the laws and the consequences of those laws and the kind of injustice that was built into them, baked into them, has impacted us because we've been swimming around in that society, right? And so all of that macro stuff has then impacted us on a micro level. And that's why those unintentional forms of racism can sometimes come up. Okay, I'm gonna go out of screen sharing for a moment there. Okay, and then so because we're constantly steeped again in this macro environment in this society, so it influences us on the micro level and maybe on an unconscious level, and then it creates blind spots for us. So in order to resist that influence, we need to actively work against it, and that's where the term anti-racism and anti-racist come in. So the idea behind the term anti-racism or anti-racist is saying that it's sort of to differentiate itself from the term not racist, because a lot of people say that, right? But I'm not racist. And that is good, obviously, but it's also more of a passive stance. It's kind of the idea of like, well, the racists are over there, I'm over here, I'm not them. But the problem with it is that idea of the macro environment, that there's a status quo that we're living in our society. As we've seen, right, that there is racism that's in it and prevalent in it. And so perpetuating that status quo is then to perpetuate the racism that's in it. So anti-racism is basically saying that we're shifting things in the opposite direction. We're actively working in the opposite direction. So anti-racism means the active and deliberate engagement in practices that dismantle racism on an individual level and then also on those larger macro levels. Anti-racism holds that no racial, ethnic group is better than the rest, and that people who are in groups that are in the racial minority don't need to change how they look or what they do, like to assimilate in order to have value. That basically everybody has value just how they are. And I wanted to stop there and talk for a moment about the idea of colorblindness, because I think that so many like well-meaning people say this, that like they're colorblind. And I think that it's tied to that idea. It's tied to this idea that they want to say that, you know, they know that all people have value. And I think in a lot of ways, people were sort of socialized to be colorblind almost in like as a reaction to the racism that was really, you know, stark and prevalent in the 1960s, that, you know, many people then, you know, because the racism that was in the 1960s was very clearly like, okay, you know, Black people are like second-class citizens. So then I think that there was like this almost trying to like correct or maybe overcorrect of like, no, all people are equal. I don't even see color. That's how far I believe that they're equal. But the problem with the idea of color blindness is basically just that we are different colors. And that color blindness means that you can't really honor and celebrate that rainbow of different colors that we are, because all of those differences are things that make us unique and things that we are proud of in a lot of ways culturally, that we are proud of. And so color blindness means that we really aren't able to celebrate those differences as much, and that those different colors that we are do impact the experiences that we have. So the way that people perceive us and the way that we perceive other people. So we can't work to dismantle racism if we are saying that we don't see races at all. And then we also shut down then the opportunity for us to be able to celebrate the pride in being those different colors too. So, and I spent time talking about color blindness in particular, because that's a mistake that I personally have made. So I remember that I have a friend in my undergraduate years, and he was a Black man. And then I said that to him, right? I said like, oh yeah, man, like, but I'm colorblind, you know? And then he was like, but Joanna, I'm Black. I was like, yeah, no, I know, but like, you know, like it just doesn't matter to me, that kind of thing, right? So I was telling him that I was colorblind, and he was trying to explain to me why that didn't really capture or wasn't really accepting of his whole experience. And I honestly didn't really get it back then. And it took a while of, you know, studying these topics and doing my own personal work to really recognize that saying that I was colorblind in that moment sort of invalidates the experiences that he has because he is a Black man. So for example, when we were in college, several times throughout our time in college, he was stopped by campus police and asked to produce his student ID to prove that he was a student at our school. Whereas that's an experience that I never had, that none of my white friends ever had. but he had several times. And so that's an experience that was because of his race. And so saying that I don't see his race means that like I might not be able to pick up on the way that race has then impacted the experiences that he had versus the ones that I've had. And this next part, I'm going to quote an author by the name of Ijeoma Oluo. She wrote a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. But she says, the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. And I just love that. And honestly, when I first saw that quote, I actually felt like a sense of relief in a way, because I think that right now in our country, it's obviously very racially charged. There's a lot of like rawness in the way that we are talking about and exploring race right now. And I think that so many people are really afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. And so it's sort of a pressure, right? That we're afraid that if we say or do the wrong thing, then, you know, like it'll be like a racist witch hunt, and then all the fingers will be pointed at us, and then, you know, we're scared. So I think that it's sort of a paradox in a way that anti-racism is actually partially accepting that idea that there's still racism that lives within us. Because again, we are raised in a society where the macro has influenced the micro. And so now we have that racism with us, and we're working to undo that. But the work is ongoing. And so there are still assumptions and biases that we might have that we need to like re-examine and think about and check every single day. But I do think that the more you practice it, the easier it becomes to catch it. And I think that pressure in a lot of ways to be like the perfect anti-racist, which again is not like a status that we can just achieve, but that pressure reminds me a lot of the pressure on us as parents in general to be perfect, like the feeling that we're afraid that someone's gonna catch us in a moment where we're not being that perfect parent or whatever, and then everyone's gonna judge us for it. But remembering as well that those imperfections or those times where maybe like, you know, we were out of sync with our child or we were struggling in some way are often the most memorable and amazing learning experiences that we can have as parents as well. So it's sort of the same with anti-racism, that, you know, we will make mistakes, we do make mistakes, and then the way that we respond and reflect about those mistakes is really where the learning happens. Adam, I wanted to check in with you there to see if any questions have come up on like racism, anti-racism, anything come to mind for you?
No, right now we've got quite a number of people who are live with us and watching this, but no specific questions have come up yet. So let's go on. Whoops.
Okay, sounds good. So I've mentioned the term privilege a couple times already. Oh, sorry, Adam, I thought you were saying something so I've mentioned the word privilege a couple times already. So I wanted to sort of unpack what that term means, because I think that it's one that's really important to this idea of racism and anti-racism. So specifically, we're talking here about racial privilege or white privilege, because those who have people. So white privilege doesn't mean that your life as a white person isn't, it just means that the color of your skin isn't something that is or has been making it harder. So I'm gonna bring up another slide for you guys on a concept called intersectionality. So intersectionality is basically this idea that we all have different aspects of our identity. Oh, my internet connection's unstable, it tells me. Hopefully we don't get interrupted here. Okay, so intersectionality is just this idea that we all have different aspects of our identity, right? So around this like kind of mega Venn diagram thing, we have all of those different aspects. So, you know, your race, your ethnicity, your sex, your religious beliefs, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, all of these things comprise our identity. And it's possible that how much you feel any one of those identities changes from situation to situation. So like, for example, for me, and I think that this example is maybe pertinent because of the Vanessa Guillen situation that happened in our US military. But like for me, if I were to walk onto like a military base that was probably primarily men, I might then in that moment feel my identity as woman sort of rise to the top in that I'm more acutely aware of my identity as woman in that moment. And so all of our different identities, they're always all there, but then they might rise to the top depending on different situations. And so it's important to note too that every single person has some identities around these circles that are the privileged identity and some identities that are not the privileged identity. And so when we're talking about, racism, right, it's possible that you as a person have experienced some sort of discrimination or prejudice on the basis of one of your other identities. But then when we're talking about racism specifically, we're talking about that white people are the ones who hold privilege in that identity. Let me stop the share and go back to just chatting here. Okay, and so privilege does, actually thinking about it a little bit more. So there was an article written by an author named Peggy McIntosh. And so she wrote, and she's a white woman herself, and she wrote an article called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which is one of the main articles on white privilege. The way that she defines it is that it's an invisible package of assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. And so she includes in this article a lot of different questions to basically get people thinking about white privilege and what it is and to kind of wrap their brains around it. So I'm gonna read some of those examples, just a few from her list. You can shop alone without being followed. You can be pretty sure that if you move into a new neighborhood that your neighbors will be nice or at least neutral to you. When you were in school and you learned about our national heritage, you learned about people like you and were taught that people of your color made it what it is. You can explore different professional or travel opportunities without wondering whether the environment will be welcoming or hostile to you. You generally feel welcomed and normal in society. And so here are some examples that she writes about children in particular, and us as parents. You can be fairly certain that sending your child to school, they will be taught curriculum that testifies their existence. You can easily buy books, toys, and art that feature people of your race. And a quick aside about that. So as I mentioned, I'm a mom and I have a little boy. And so I'm sure many of you, if you're parents, are familiar with the toy set Little People. It's like a Fisher Price. Fisher Price has a bunch of different ones. There's like a farm and a school and different vehicles. So we were gifted several of those Little People sets. I think we have the plane and the train and the school bus. So we got the vehicles, and then it came with a bunch of little people to ride those different vehicles. And then so I was looking at the Little People that we have or that came with those sets, right? And then I realized that out of all of the little people that came with it, there was only one who was Black, and then everybody else that came with the Little People sets were white. And so I was thinking about that, and I was like, okay, that doesn't represent our family, or it doesn't represent me, it doesn't represent my son. And so let me look for other Little People. So I go on Amazon, I search for like Asian Little People. And so then I found them, and then so I bought that set, and then now we've integrated that set into our Little People toys. And so it's sort of that idea, right? That as a white person, you can probably buy the standard set that comes with the toys, but I have to go and buy the expansion pack in order for me to feel represented in those toys. Okay, yeah. And then thinking about, again, like the McIntosh's example of privileges, she writes, you do not have to educate your children to be aware of systemic racism for their own safety. So thinking about that idea again of colorblindness, saying that you're colorblind sort of invalidates all of those above experiences that people experience, or that people of color experience just navigating our society about like regular everyday things, those times where they've maybe felt like invisible or uncomfortable in situations that for a lot of people with privilege, they just don't have to think about. It's just not something that really impacts them on the day-to-day. And privilege does impact outcomes as well. So there was a study done in which they sent out resumes that were completely identical, except for the only difference was the name at the top. And then when they sent out the resumes, people with white sounding names were 50% more likely to be offered an interview than the same exact resumes with a black sounding name at the top. Or, I mean, in recent current events, if we can think about the situation of Amy Cooper, who was the woman in Central Park who called the police on the man that was bird watching. And so she said in that video, if any of you have watched it, she said that I will say a black man is threatening my life. And so by including that black man is threatening my life, she was wielding her privilege in that moment, because she knew on some level that if she said that the police would come to her aid first, that they would protect her in the situation as a default. So depending on where you are in this journey, confronting these topics, it's usually like right about now where those different reactions might be coming up. And a lot of people definitely bristle when we start talking about white privilege. And I think that there's several reasons for that. For a lot of people, I think that it's the first time that they're being described by their race, like being described like as white. And again, that is sort of the idea, because white in a lot of ways is sort of the default in American society. So there's the idea of hyphenated Americans, meaning that like I'm an Asian American, someone else can be an African American or a Hispanic American. But the term American by itself, even though theoretically it should or does comprise, or should, it'd be built in that it does include any of those other people, it's like I have to carry around that expansion pack, right? Whereas somebody who is white maybe doesn't have to specify, oh, I'm a white American, right? And I think that another reason that uncomfortable feelings sort of come up around this time is when people are grappling with white privilege, is because I think that it's also the first time that a lot of people see themselves as part of this system, and a system that oftentimes you're trying to distance yourself from, like I mentioned, right? Like that you don't want to be lumped in with like, racism and things like that. And so if those uncomfortable feelings are coming up for you, just sit with those feelings and get curious about where they're coming from. But the important part is don't let that discomfort stop you from continuing, or, don't let it paralyze you from continuing your journey to read and to understand and to grow. Because acknowledging the ways that white people benefit from white privilege isn't the same as accusing every single white person of being automatically a racist. It's really just showing an awareness that we're living in a society that's been set up that it's a bit easier to be white. And so examining your privilege is just a call to be aware that the experiences that you've had walking around in your life aren't the same as the experience that others have had. And you can't obviously walk around in other people's skin, but just having that awareness that it might be different for some people, and let them to share that experience, the version of the experiences that they've had is so important. That's the main goal, really. There was a social justice activist by the name of Jane Elliott, and she's white herself, and she was asking an auditorium of people, if you think that the experience of being white and Black in America are the same, who would switch? So taking this one step further and thinking about our children, right? Who would wish that switch upon their child? And going back to McIntosh's list of privileges, she talks about how Black parents have to have very difficult conversations with their children way too early on how the world may not treat them fairly because of the color of their skin, and for only that reason, just because of the color of their skin. And we think about the loss of innocence in that moment for a young child who thinks that the world is a pretty exciting place to be, and then finds out one day from their parents that there might be a situation in which that world doesn't welcome or accept them just because of the color of their skin. And parents do this not because they want to hurt their child or want to take away that innocence, but rather to protect them, and to, for a child to learn that or to hear that from somebody that loves them and, from somebody that they trust, as opposed to going out in the world and learning that lesson in a harsher way from the world, and learning that lesson in a way that could have very high stakes. So thinking especially about like the incident of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, who was a boy who was out in a park playing with like a Nerf gun. And then a police officer thought that he had a real gun and then shot him dead. so if that is the experience and the talk that Black parents feel that they have to have with their children, I think that the very least we can do as parents with white or some racial privilege is to help our children understand race at a very young age and to arm them with words so that they can ask questions and articulate their thoughts and ideas and create a dialogue that builds insight, reflection, and critical thinking about these topics and about our society. And so that's really the first step when we're thinking about raising anti-racist children, is to talk about it. Because again, if we take a passive stance, then we are sort of complicit in that system, because then it makes the problem invisible. If we don't talk about it, then the problem is invisible. And so or even, taboo, to not just invisible, right? Like if your child sort of gets the sense that race is an uncomfortable topic and, let's avoid talking about it, then they grow up and then they become adults who are then not prepared for the reality of racism in the world or how to talk about those ideas in the world. So when we're thinking about talking about racism, these are conversations and things we need to do early and often. And then we are going to, as parents, support their development, because research indicates that the children do perceive race from a very young age. And so we're supporting their development by helping them to learn how to talk about it as they grow up in increasingly complex ways. So it's like anything parenting wise, right? So if you want to teach your kid to be good with money, for example, chances are that when they're like 2 and 3 years old, you're not talking to them about investing in the stock market. Like at 2 and 3, you're probably talking to them about things like, okay, this is a penny and this is a dime and this is a nickel. And, you're identifying different types of coins and their value. And then maybe when they're a little bit older, then you start talking about like the importance of saving money. And then maybe when they're older than that, then, we talk about doing chores for allowance and working for your money. And then maybe when they're a teenager, you start to talk about like car loans and interest. And then, you get into the more sophisticated topics of personal finance, right? And so you're always talking about money, but the way that you're talking about money is getting increasingly complex as your children are growing up. So talking about race is exactly like that. What the narrative or what actions you are taking as they grow, you're just scaffolding them to increasing levels of complexity. And then also, just like other parenting things, that what you say is nowhere near as important as what you do. And so children are always learning by what you model, like from the first words that children say when they're little to the games they play. Like if you have a child that's like the pretend play age, maybe like 3 to 7 or whatever, and they have like a kitchen set, right? And they're pretending to serve breakfast or something like that. If you listen to them or see what they're doing, chances are they're probably saying the same things or doing the same things that you do when you serve them breakfast. So in the same way that we model polite words so that your children learn to use polite words and things like that, the best way to raise anti-racist children then is to actively engage in that process yourself, actively work to engage in dismantling your own internalized systems of racism, to choose anti-racist actions, and then those actions will then trickle down to your child. So we'll get a little bit more into the child development piece now. I wanted to check in, Adam, once more and see if there's any questions that have come up so far, anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, so I think you're kind of already beginning to transition into it, but the questions that have come up is really around the nuts and bolts of what are those good ways to begin having these conversations. I got an email from somebody who had said, what if my kid just sort of points out, a young child points out that there's a difference in color, just sort of recognizing those differences. And then I think people are looking for that kind of concrete nuts and bolt guidance, because I clearly that's where the most anxiety comes for parents.
Yes, absolutely.
How do I really engage my child in this? What is a good question? What is a good way to make an observation?
Perfect. Thank you for that segue. Yes, that's exactly what we're about to do now. Is there anything else that comes up before I get going on that topic?
You know what? There's a question that I can't see the whole question for some reason. So just hang on, let me just see if I can just kind of get the whole question out for some reason. I don't know why I can't see it. You know what? I'm gonna. What I'll do is I'll do this. If I can get the full question to come up, and I think it's something else, I'll shoot it to you as a chat. Okay. Perfect.
Sounds good.
Perfect.
Okay. So yes, thank you for whoever asked that question. So we'll get into that right now. There's some of those more concrete steps. So I think the first question with regards to child development is like, do children see race, or how do children see race? Because I think that a lot of people have the idea that like children are colorblind, or meaning that like, you know, it's not something that matters to children, or children aren't born aware of race. So then by talking about race, like we make them racist or make them more aware of that. So I think it is true that children are not born racist, right? And so racism, just like any other things, is something that is taught, unfortunately, either explicitly or implicitly to children. But children do perceive difference. And I actually have some slides for you guys so that we can have that information a little bit more clearly or concretely for you. So how do children perceive race? So this is based on research. First, even infants as young as 6 months can discern the difference among racial groups. And they actually begin to show some preference for their own race or for the race of their caregivers. So even as young as 6 months. By 2 to 3 years, children begin to categorize people by race. And if we think about what's happening in that 2 to 3 years age range, like that's the age that we're asking kids things like, oh, what color is this? How many are there? Does that animal live in the water? Does that, like things like that. And so we're asking them to sort, right? I mean, we give them those sorting beads and things like that. And so of course they're doing those same things about people too. They're just making sense of the world in that way by sorting, because that's what they're doing at that age. By 2 and 3, they also are beginning to internalize stereotypes and a hierarchy among races. And so there was a study done, this video is actually on YouTube, I think you can find it, about where they asked children that were about like this preschool age, right, to pick out the doll that is pretty. And then they give them a white doll and a black doll. And then children, both white children and black children, were more likely to choose the white doll in that situation. So as young as 2 and 3, they're already beginning to pick up on that hierarchy, the racial hierarchy that has been perpetuated in our society. And then by 5 to 7, they begin by then to prefer same race friendships, sort of the idea of like birds of a feather flock together. But also that the research has indicated that explicit conversations about interracial friendships improve racial attitudes, and actually even as quickly as a week. So we're going to go through the different stages of development now to figure out how you can start to have these conversations or start to incorporate anti-racist practices in parenting all the way up the lifespan. So we'll start at our littlest children, babies. So I'm going to ask you guys a series of questions about how your baby might see the world. Because the thing about babies, right, is that their world is pretty small at that age. We are pretty much their whole world, their family, their immediate surroundings. And so therefore we have quite a lot of power in the world that they see. So here are some questions, more so just as a guide to help you reflect on the world that your baby sees. So who are the Black people that your child sees? So we're thinking about things like the quantity of them, but also like what roles are they in? Do they see a lot of Black people? And then what are they doing? Does your family have authentic relationships with people who are not your race? And if not, why? What characters are featured in their books, media, art, and toys? And a note about books here. So under 10% of children's books feature an African-American or Black character, a Black child as the main character of that book. So again, we're thinking about that idea of the expansion pack, right? So when you're looking for books, if you look and buy what's accessible or what's commonly out there, chances are that you might not buy something that centers around an African-American character. So it does mean you'll have to like opt into that expansion pack in order to have that as part of what your child sees. And also I like to say too that, so in my house, we definitely certainly have books about like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and historical figures that are Black in American history. And it's really important to know that history, don't get me wrong. But also it's really important that you also buy books that show Black children doing regular things that children do. So for example, there's a book called The Snowy Day, and it's about a little boy who wakes up and then snow has fallen overnight. And then it's basically just about how he spends his snow day. And I think it's so important to include books like that too, that where just Black children are doing normal stuff, because it humanizes them, right? It shows like, oh, that child looks different from me, but also we enjoy the same things. So I mean, as the personal aside, right, when I saw the movie on Netflix called To All the Boys I've Loved Before, it's like a romantic comedy, and then the main character is an Asian American girl. I just felt like so seen in that. And then also so, like, it was just so nice to see like an Asian character in a movie that like wasn't about geishas or martial arts or things like that, because those are important aspects of culture in a lot of different Asian countries. But it was just so nice to be able to see a movie in which that Asian American identity is like celebrated and acknowledged, but also shows like the regular everyday, you know, like love life stuff that happens to all teenagers. And then also with dolls and pretend play. So I do think that it's really important for the toys that your child has to be positive representations of themselves, right? And that's totally why I went and bought the Little People set and everything on Amazon. But also thinking about that when children are playing, they're creating a world, right? And so it's really important that we give them the tools to be able to create a world that also reflects the world that's outside, meaning a world that includes Black people, Asian people, Latino people, and white people, right? So to give them toys as well that reflect the world outside. Okay, moving a little bit up in development. So we're talking about our preschoolers or children who are verbal. And, you know, the question that was already asked about like, you know, well, my child just makes comments, right? And so the first one here is how do we react to their questions or comments? So as I said, children of this age are sorting and they're perceiving differences. We often ask them questions about what those differences are that they see, right? And so we need to, first of all, respond to their question or comment in a way that's non-shaming to them, right? Because then if we like hush them or something like that, it sort of sends the message that that's taboo, that's something that we're not going to talk about, right? And like once upon a time, I was a teacher's aide in a preschool classroom, and a little girl said to me, "Why are your thighs so big?" And in that moment, I don't think that she meant to be rude. And I think in a lot of times, we as adults, we get embarrassed. We feel like it sounds rude, and that's because we are carrying as adults, again, this hierarchy that we have in our heads about, you know, what society has created about like what is beautiful or what is desirable, right? And so again, I think that child was really just showing that she saw a difference, right? That this lady's legs don't look like the legs of my mom or, you know, whoever that she sees in her life, right? And so one important thing to frame when we respond to these questions, that those differences are not deficits, that those differences are actually assets. And actually the way that I responded to that little girl in the preschool classroom was that my thighs are so big because I'm so strong. And so when children make comments or ask questions about like the differences that they see in other people, it's really important that we, first of all, affirm, yes, that there is a difference. And we see that difference too, because the difference is there, right? And then talk about those differences. So for example, like say a kid says something like, his hair is really tall or something like that. So you could say something like, yeah, his hair is really tall. His hair has a different texture than our hair. And that's how it can create that shape. Isn't that cool? Or something like that. Or, you know, so really you're honoring like the uniqueness and the beauty in those differences. And then it's also like a opportunity as well to talk about things like, so if kids say something about like skin color or something like that, you can talk about like melanin in skin and the reason that people's skin is different colors. And also then how do we model positive interactions with people who are different from us? So like, for example, if you're somebody who like makes small talk with people at the checkout line at a store or something like that, you know, make small talk with all sorts of people who are, especially people who are different from you too, just because it's modeling for your child on like a very basic level of just like, you know, that this other person that we see is different from us. And this is somebody that, you know, we still want to form a connection with, or that we still, that they are worthy of our time and our positivity in that moment, right? And so that's a way that we are teaching kids to embrace people, all different kinds of people, especially people who are different from us. It's a way that we're teaching them that in a way that's not explicit, right? We're not sitting them down necessarily and talking to them about like, you should talk to people who are different from you, but it's just something that we're doing, and children pick up on that. And it's really a powerful, but very subtle way. Talking about children who are elementary school age. So think about like, what messages do children of this age receive about Black people and the neighborhoods where Black people live? So I live in Chicago. Chicago is a very segregated city. And I've definitely heard conversations in which people say things like, oh, well, all of the violence really happens in 3 neighborhoods, and we would never go there anyway, right? And I'm not going to pretend that violence in Chicago is not a problem, because it's definitely a problem. And I think that the people who are most impacted by the problem are the people who live in those communities. And so they certainly are impacted by and care about that problem the most. But I think that in the ways that we talk about those neighborhoods, it's really important that we humanize the people that are there, right? Because in those neighborhoods, children live in those neighborhoods, teachers and doctors and regular people live in those neighborhoods. So it's really important to remember that. Another thing that Ibram X. Kendi says is to tell your child they don't have less because they are less, and we don't have more because we are more. And the violence or any of the problems that are happening in those communities are not due to the color of their skin. They're really actually due to the poverty and systemic racism, or I should say, systemic racism, and then the subsequent problems like poverty that have occurred. And so we need to really think about that, about humanizing the people that are there and realizing that a neighborhood and a person in general are way more than just the problem that they have, right? And it doesn't represent the whole race. Does your child have authentic relationships with those who are not their race? And then again, if not, just get curious about that. Is it a matter of opportunity? Is it preference? What's going on there? If you are white, does your children know that they are white? Do you talk about being white? So again, it's important here to not let the term white become synonymous for normal or the default. And so it is something that should be brought up as well. So it might be something like wondering out loud when white has become the default. So for example, if they're watching a TV show or something like that, and all of the characters are white, it might be something as simple as just saying all of the characters are white on this show. And maybe wondering oh, I wonder how the show might have been different if they had a Black kid on the show, or had an Asian person, or a person who was from a different country or a different religion. And so just, again, noticing and maybe slightly resisting in that moment that idea of that the white people are the default or the normal people. And also thinking about, and especially in TV shows as well, it also means things like calling out stereotypes about people of color that, these stereotypes that are unfortunately prevalent in a lot of mainstream media. So again, we're thinking about the shows and things like that, and how. And it also means as well, seeking out shows, opting in for the expansion packs on shows in which people of color, especially Black people, are featured in a way that's positive, right? From shows like Doc McStuffins all the way up. And then Common Sense Media is a really great place to start looking for shows in your child's specific age range. I put a note on this slide too to talk about the idea, the book called Not My Idea. So this is a book that was just very recently written by a mom who is white. And so she wrote a book for her child for use with families on how to talk about whiteness and your role as a white person in this larger moment in history. And then how are they making sense of the world? I think the best way to figure out how your children are making sense of the world is actually to eavesdrop and to sort of be a fly on the wall. So for example, if you're driving your child and they're just, chatting with a friend in the back seat or something like that, to sort of take a curious and reflective stance on, what are they talking about? And what questions are they having? How are they making sense of everything? How are they, how are they connecting dots? Are they connecting dots that should be connected or not? And how do they understand their role in all of this? Because once you find out what they know, then you can sort of supplement them with the information that they may need, and then also give them some ideas about their role in all of this. So I think that something that's really important for elementary age kids is is fairness. And I'm sure if you have an elementary age child, you've heard well, that's not fair. And so fairness, I think, is actually a very cool port of entry into conversations about race, because then you can share with them examples of people who have utilized power and privilege to take action against racism and make the world a place that's more fair. And I think that this age range as well is a really good time to talk about the power of the bystander. the power of the bystander is a topic that has come up a lot in like anti-bullying curriculums in schools and things like that. So it's possible that they're kind of familiar with it, but like, you know, the idea that there's a bully and then there's somebody else who's being bullied, but then actually the people who have the most power and also responsibility in that situation are actually the people around them, the bystanders, who are, you know, watching everything and then have like an ability to make it right. And so even thinking about George Floyd, for example, I mean, the reason that we know about that situation as a society, right, is because of bystanders, because of people who bothered to trouble themselves, to stop, to record it, to make sure that the recording got out, and to bring that to light so that it could be addressed. And so when thinking about our teens, I think that power of the bystander thing, that concept, is something that's so important to them at this time. Because I mean, think about the teenage years. What's really happening during those years is that they're developing their voice, they're developing their identity. They're thinking about, you know, things like peer pressure, of daring to go against something that's happening, or maybe something that's popular that's happening, right? Finding that inner strength, really, you know, working through like what is their moral compass and things like that. And so understanding their role as like the bystanders to look at something that's happening and then to figure out what they can do and their role in that moment. And I think that the teenage years as well are a good time to really figure out like what do they know, and give them resources and also the safety to learn more. I put on the slide here a book called Stamped that was also written by Ibram X. Kendi. He wrote a larger, more dense book called Stamped from the Beginning, which is, you can imagine why it's dense. It's a history of racist ideas or something like that. But then he wrote, along with Jason Reynolds, a more like accessible version for like teens and young adults to be able to grapple with those topics too. And so I think that this is the age where, like, you know, they're really maybe getting into the more painful or harsh moments of history. And in thinking about history, can they think critically about what they consume? So there's a series of questions that I think are very important to ask your teen about what they're consuming, whether it's something they're reading or watching or listening to or whatever. It's a series of questions that if you keep asking them these questions, then they begin to ask themselves these questions about their what they are reading and consuming, and then they can begin to be more of critical thinkers in general about what they consume. So the questions are: whose voice is this? If they're reading something, what perspective is being offered? What voices are being omitted, even though they were present there for the situation? So, you know, we're thinking about concepts like that history was written by the victors, right? That the victors then wrote a version of history that glorifies, you know, what they did. But then it also means that in those moments of history in which maybe those same victors did things that weren't right or were painful or were horrible in some instances, they either will glaze over that or omit it entirely. And so, you know, so often in curriculum, we're missing voices of people who were there, right? And thinking about, like, you know, black folks have been, you know, came from Africa starting in like 1618, right? And so often in, you know, history textbooks that we read, their perspectives aren't really as included in the curriculum. And so thinking about that and thinking about different ways to help your child to think critically about, like, you know, who else was there? And then who was writing this, and who was it written for? What is the audience that was intended? So again, those questions I think are ones that are useful to help your child to start thinking about how they can think critically about what they're consuming. And then this next series of questions, is probably important, just parenting a teen in general, right? But thinking about social media, because social media is something that's really important to teens. But who is your child following on social media? What voices do they hold as important, or who are their role models? Are they hearing from people from voices who are different than theirs? And so thinking about those ideas as ways that we can get our teens to start expanding what they know and how they think about it. So I want to leave time for questions if we can, otherwise, it's 2:00 already. So I will leave you with this. I'm about to show a slide that's very, very dense, and I know this is being recorded, so I figure that you guys can just look at the next slide and then pause it and look at it a little further. But basically, that it's okay to not have all the answers to these questions just yet. And so if any of the questions that I asked are questions that you can't answer yourself, or are questions that you have more questions about, like sometimes it just makes us aware about how many questions we then have, we can, take note of those things and then Google them and get to know a wider scope of American history. Like I had a friend who was given off for Juneteenth, and then she said, like, I was really, like, my company gave me off. I didn't know what Juneteenth was. I didn't know what, and I was like embarrassed that I'm in my 30s and I had no idea what this was. And again, it's because the curriculum that we were taught in a lot of ways didn't include things like that. So again, there's not shame in not knowing something, but there is shame in not finding out once you do realize that you don't know. And then ask questions yourself about, like, why is that? And it's not always even doing additional things, because I think that can feel overwhelming sometimes. So just get curious in your own life about your own life practices, and then expand or enhance what you do. So like if you're a member of a book club or something like that, think about like how many books have we read by Black authors, or like maybe suggest one that your book club could read. So do things that feel meaningful to you, but do them. So commit to maybe doing one thing each day. So here's my slide on a lot of different ways that you can do this. This is I wrote a very, very short list of ideas, right? But maybe one thing each day, right? Whether it's following a new person on social media, or it's attending another workshop, or advocating, or sending a message about your school curriculum that your child is learning in school, reading a new book, or watching something on Netflix that is related to these topics. So just again, expand where you're at, but just keep going, even when, and especially when this process feels hard. Okay. I'm going to stop there. Adam, I know that we are over time. But I wanted to check in and see if there were any questions that you felt weren't addressed, or anything else that we can cover quickly before we go.
No, I don't have any, Heather. I'm just looking right now. I'm not seeing any additional questions. And I do appreciate the audience. We've gone over by a few minutes. So without any additional questions, Joanna, if you just want to kind of, whatever kind of final observations, thoughts, guidance you have for parents. I think, like I said before, parents are often just looking for those nuts and bolts, and I think you've done a really nice job. I think those slides with the kind of some specific things to look at and topics to raise and questions, I think that was really helpful. Any kind of final words or thoughts that you have to help provide parents that guidance?
Not really. Just thank you guys for attending, and thank you guys for taking that action step. Right, today was an action step that you already did in this process, and just that. Keep going. The journey is ongoing. So thank you guys so much for tuning in.
Joanna, I want to thank you so much for presenting today. I want to thank everybody who was able to attend, and we'll try to keep this going. I don't know what the next workshop following this will be, but I hope to be continuing workshops on this very, very important topic. So Joanna, I wish you the best. Have a great day.
Thank you.
And to everybody who's attended, thank you so much. And let your friends know that this will be posted on our website if they want to watch it at a future time. Again, thank you and have a wonderful day.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.